I'd like to welcome you all to the final part of our Global Tipping Point series. First, I'd like to remind you about our annual fundraiser next week, featuring someone you might know, one of the world's most influential peacemakers, Senator George Mitchell. It's taking place on Monday evening at 6 p.m. at Southern New Hampshire University, and we only have a few tickets left. So if you're planning on joining us, please purchase your ticket this evening or in advance so we can guarantee you a seat at this very special event. By now, I know you're probably familiar with our nonprofit organization and our critical mission of promoting understanding of world affairs across the state. But let me urge you once again to support us as a member, donor, or by attending our Global Forum fundraiser if you've joined us for any part of the series and believe, as we do, that global education is the key to our state and country's future success. If you've gained a new perspective on solutions for third world poverty, or weighed whether America has superpower illusions over the past several months with the help of our experts, our work has made a difference. Our programs are helping increase your global competency, along with that of your friends, neighbors, leaders, teachers, and students. By exposing our communities to international issues, the Council is not only helping build this global competency, but also inspiring our state citizens to develop the desire and habit of engaging with the world on a continuing basis. Whether or not you believe that America is in decline or that America will always be exceptional, it's clear to everyone that without global competency, our state and our country are at risk. In fact, the Council on Foreign Relations recently labeled America's educational failures as a national security risk. Why? Its report warned that human capital will determine power in the current century, and the failure to produce that capital will undermine America's security. Large, undereducated swaths of the population damage the ability of the U.S. to physically defend itself, protect its secure information, conduct diplomacy, and grow its economy. With so much at stake, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to everyone here who's a member of the World Affairs Council and ask you to stand and be recognized for supporting our work. Please stand if you're a member. Thank you. I hope that everyone here who's not yet a member would fill out the form on your seat and join tonight or purchase a ticket to our fundraiser, and you'll be standing with us in support of global education and understanding. Now I'd like to wrap up the series by sincerely thanking the University of New Hampshire, Manchester for being our series partner, along with the university's History, Humanities, and Politics and Society programs. I'd also like to thank our very generous sponsor, Amoskeag Airport Service, based right here in Manchester, for helping us present this series free of charge to the community. Now, introducing our speaker is Professor Jack Resch of UNH Manchester and a World Affairs Council board member.
Well, we have the pleasure tonight to welcome Frank Cillufffo back to his home state of New Hampshire. Although he was born in New York City, this is his home. Frankie, as he's known to his parents, Iria and Frank Cillufffo, are from Portsmouth. Frankie comes to his interest in international affairs naturally. His mother, Iria, is the honorary consul for Estonia, and his father, Frank, does business internationally. More than a homecoming, we have in store this evening insights and observations from one of the country's leading authorities on homeland security. Frank offers a unique perspective. On the one hand, he views homeland security from his academic position as Associate Vice President at George Washington University and head of its Homeland Security Policy Institute. On the other hand, his views reflect on-the-ground experience, serving in the White House as special assistant to President George W. Bush and as an advisor to Tom Ridge, who was the first Secretary of Homeland Security. The significance of his work, and it is abundant, and the value of his judgment are reflected in requests from Congress to give testimony before committees, his service on congressional committees, and participation in international meetings on security. We look forward to your comments tonight, Frank, and insights that will get us behind the headlines and give us a better understanding of what we face as a nation in securing our homeland. Please join me in welcoming Frank Cillufffo.
Thank you, Professor Fresh, and thank you to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, to UNH Manchester. This is a homecoming of sorts, and thank you for the very overly kind introduction. It's the kind of introduction that would make a father smile and perhaps a mother even believe. So I say that for what it is. If I were to introduce myself, it would be very quick. Frank Cillufffo, he who displays the varying degrees of ignorance in a lot of subjects. Well, I promise, and I will try not to shed too much ignorance on some of the world views that are affecting our country today, and obviously the broader global community. But I will also try to be somewhat brief, since I've never had an unspoken thought. But most importantly, what I'd like to be able to do is draw upon the various questions and perspectives in the audience. This is no longer class time. You don't need a lecture. This shouldn't be a monologue. I hope that we can foster as much of a dialogue as we humanly can. Let me start with an old inside the beltway, since we're talking Washington, tactic and technique. It's been attributed to Henry Kissinger, but I think he is by no means the only one who has used this tactic. When in doubt, sound pessimistic. You appear better informed. And if doomsday does not occur, you can always pat yourself on the back for averting yet another disaster. So keep in mind, those in the national security business, we don't get paid to see the world through rosy eyeglasses. We get paid to see the shortcomings of our policies. We get paid to see the dark side of globalization. And we get paid ultimately to think the unthinkable. Ideally, as I think it was President Kennedy who said, the time to fix your roof is when it's sunny, not when it's raining. So the whole idea of what we try to be able to do and to engage folks is to ask some of the hard questions, question assumptions, which has always been one of Washington's shortcomings, and ultimately try to project and look out as much as one can. And I know we're in Red Sox country, but I'll throw a Yogi Berra quote out there who once said, the future ain't what it used to be. And I agree with him on that. But the best way to predict the future, in my eyes, is to be able to shape the future. And hopefully some of those in our policymaking community are able to do that as much as they can. Let me start with a quick snapshot in terms of the threat environment we see today. Ding dong, the witch is not dead. As significant as the death of Osama bin Laden was, it by no means spells the end of Al-Qaeda, nor does it spell the end of the broader terrorism threat and the like. I thought it might be useful, and I don't want to get too wonky, so cut me off if you have questions, but I thought it might be helpful to be able to sort of give a state of play in terms of where we are today. With the death of Osama bin Laden, which is very significant, don't underestimate its significance, not only tactically and operationally, but also symbolically. He ultimately had this strong symbolic image that he was able to take on the superpower of the United States and evade authority and evade justice as he did for 10 years. I might also state that when I was in the White House, much of what we saw in May in Abbottabad could not have occurred on 9/12/2001. Not because the inspiration wasn't there, not because the motivation wasn't there, not because the desire wasn't there, but a lot of the authorities and capabilities that were brought to bear in this one very significant event just weren't around on 9/11. And I don't want to go too deep, but in essence, you saw the synchronization of various titles and authorities that oversee the intelligence community, that oversee the defense community, and also to one extent or another, the broader domestic homeland community. In this case, it was the synchronization of Titles 10 and Title 50. And basically that defines the role of the intelligence community and the role of the armed services community. Much of what you saw there could not have occurred if that wasn't inextricably interwoven, where you saw various entities that historically didn't even know one another's names, let alone work together on common issues. But literally, you saw the synchronization of these various assets. This was a long-standing set of missions, one that had a huge tail that no one will ever see, in large part because the men and women who are doing some of the hardest work will never get recognized for the hard work that they're doing. But the intelligence community, intelligence capacity that was brought to bear to be able to ultimately get to the point where we can take action on a very significant actor is hugely laborious and hugely dangerous, I might add. So the men and women who you're never going to hear about, they're the ones who ultimately deserve all of America's credit. They're the ones who ultimately we owe a huge debt of thanks to. And I had the privilege of being able to work with some of those folks. My role was very easy, comparatively speaking. But ultimately, it's the men and women in uniform, whether in our armed services or our first responder communities, firefighters, law enforcement officers, paramedics, and the like. These are the men and women who are putting themselves in harm's way every day, or potentially not even in uniform at all if they're inside the intelligence community. And in many ways, they're the most vulnerable and susceptible because they don't have the protection of a uniform should something go wrong. But in terms of the threat, we've seen Al-Qaeda metastasize, and it comes in various shapes, sizes, flavors, and forms, ranging from Al-Qaeda senior leadership, which is still significant, it's still operating, now run by Osama bin Laden's longtime deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is overseeing Al-Qaeda senior leadership, as we would refer to it, or Al-Qaeda Central. But along with Al-Qaeda senior leadership, you've seen a number of Al-Qaeda affiliates pop up and sprout. And the most significant ones include Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is operating out of North Africa and the Sahel, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. This was the organization you may have read about Anwar al-Awlaki's demise as well, an American who ultimately became the largest proselytizer for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was also the group that was directly responsible for our so-called booty bomber of a year and a half ago, who attempted to blow up a plane coming to the United States, as well as the toner plots, which you may not have heard as much about, that these were plots to basically conceal explosives, an improvised explosive device through, in essence, FedEx, through overnight mail. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is probably the most significant of the organizations we're dealing with right now, but by no means the only one. You've also seen it metastasize also throughout East Africa, from Yemen on down to Somalia. Somalia is home to Al-Shabaab, which is another jihadist organization that is claimed affinity and actually swore allegiance to Al-Qaeda senior leadership lately. They are also an organization that has been home to dozens of Americans traveling to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab. In fact, the first two in recent history known suicide/homicide bombers, ultimately Americans, ultimately joined up with Al-Shabaab. Obviously they're dead, so they're not a threat today. But there is a big concern of what we refer to as foreign fighters. These are Westerners traveling to jihadi conflict zones, who not only gain experience and serve as an enhancement to the indigenous and local causes overseas, but ultimately they are what in law enforcement we refer to as clean skins. That's not a politically incorrect statement. It simply means individuals with no known criminal affiliation or terrorist affiliation, ultimately come back to the West. So that is obviously a big concern. That's precisely what you saw with the 7/7 bombers in the UK a few years back. So you've got Somalia, you've got Yemen, you've got the Maghreb, which is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and that's spreading throughout the Sahel of Africa. Why Yemen? Why Somalia? Why the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan? Why Afghanistan? These are and undergoverned spaces. These are areas where terrorist organizations and insurgencies have the ability to maneuver, they have the ability to train, they have the ability to fundraise, they have the ability to recruit, and you've got an audience that's more susceptible to the radicalization of one sort or another. So when you really look at these sorts of issues, people call it whack-a-mole. I mean, you can focus in certain areas, but to some extent, you've got to start dealing with the metastasization of the threat and how it's spread. Pakistan itself is by no means a good picture. And here you've seen groups that at one time were very locally oriented, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba. Is anyone familiar with LET? Well, LET is probably up there if you were to rack and stack in terms of most capable terrorist organizations. They're clearly in the top 5. This was the group behind the Mumbai bombings. This was also a group that had an American, David Headley, who ultimately did the reconnaissance and surveillance of particular targets that were attacked. Again, he flew under the radar screen, flew under a pseudonym, ultimately was able to do that, came back to the United States. And he wasn't arrested for the Mumbai attacks, by the way. He was arrested because he was also up to another plot. In this case, he was going after the cartoonist in Sweden when he ultimately got on our intelligence community's radar screen. So you've got Lashkar-e-Taiba, Haqqani Network. Anyone familiar with the Haqqani Network? The Haqqani Network is probably one of the most sophisticated insurgencies operating out of Pakistan, but also within the Fatah region into Afghanistan. They're directly responsible for a majority of the attacks on U.S. troops, and quite honestly, think of them more as a state within a state. They don't necessarily, they're not like a terrorist organization that's preying on a weak state. They, in essence, are the state, and basically, they're the ones who determine the rules, the laws, the regs, and everything else in the region. So the Haqqani Network is an organization that, from a U.S. national security perspective, clearly poses a very significant threat. Now, one would argue that Pakistan is complicit in a lot of the activities you're seeing here. Lashkar-e-Taiba that I mentioned was historically focused on India and looking at and engaged in the Kashmir, since it's a Kashmiri jihadi organization. The Haqqani Network was historically focused on projecting out toward Afghanistan. Both of these groups now are getting pulled into a broader Pakistani set of issues, and where I'm not in a position to say they're directed by ISI, clearly they've gotten a lot of support by Pakistani intelligence services. So when we deal with Pakistan, which we have to recognize that there's a whole other set of issues that goes on sub rosa that has huge implications for U.S. national security, including the health, safety, and welfare of our men and women overseas. In addition to the Haqqani Network, you've got a very active organization called Kuji. This was Ilyas Kashmiri. This was probably the biggest terrorist killed that none of you have ever heard of, or maybe some of you have heard of. Think of him as the Kevin Bacon of terrorism. He had connections to everybody. Ultimately, he's the one who conflated a lot of these organizations that had their own indigenous and regional objectives under the banner of Al-Qaeda. This is significant because today they're no longer just focused on their particular set of issues, but clearly the United States, Israel, India, and the broader West is all in their crosshairs. And what makes this kind of unique is that these organizations are professionally run. They have more traditional military and unconventional warfare capabilities. And Ilyas Kashmiri was the ultimate connector of all these organizations. So when people talk about these groups are connected, they're not connected. It's rarely as clear or simple to be able to say they're directed, because now decision-making is being pushed, just like every corporation. You don't wait for headquarters to make a decision. The decisions are being made down at the pointy end of the spear in the military sense or in the battlefield sense, and in corporations they're being made closer to the customer. Well, that's precisely what you're seeing in the counterterrorism environment, which is vexing, because it's not as simple as a hierarchical top-down. We take this person out, we're going to get that effect, and that effect. There's a cascading effect, and those decisions are being made at a much more local kind of level. So that's the very quick Al-Qaeda picture. That's the more Al-Qaeda-oriented, affiliated, and in some cases franchise threat environment. But we've also seen the threat spread to our own countries, including the United States. Can anyone in this room tell me how many plots there have been in the United States since 9/11? Anyone want to take a chance, take a shot? 900. Thank goodness we don't have 900 plots. These are actual significant plots.
Are you counting the ones that were initiated by the FBI or not counting?
I mean, initiated by the FBI.
Well, the FBI will often sting people by saying, hey, you go bomb something, and the person tries to go bomb something, the FBI catches them.
Actually, the FBI gives them every out, every opportunity to exfiltrate themselves in every operation, undercover operation they've run. So I very much disagree with that characterization, please.
Sir, when you say plots, what do you mean?
Actual significant events that are beyond aspiration. These are actually in the planning
Were buildings
phases.
bombed, were people killed, or these
Attempts.
just perceptions of people who wanted to damage?
No, it's where they actually had actual operational plans in place to be
Were
able
the
to.
plans finished?
These were mostly foiled. There have been 2 unfortunate successful terrorist
How many
cases.
successful ones were there?
2 since 9/11.
Two, okay.
But there have been 58 major plots that have been prevented since 9/11. And some of those plots are not very, they're wannabes. So in some cases, they had the aspiration, they had the intent, they had the ability to get some of the weaponry, but they weren't necessarily at the highest level of sophistication, certainly not at the level of Hezbollah or Hamas or Lashkar-e-Taiba, or even an Al-Qaeda. But then there were some that were very significant, such as one, Najib al-Azazi was his name. This was a naturalized American who traveled to Pakistan, ultimately wanted to join up with the Taliban. Ultimately, the Taliban recognized he's a much greater value, turned him around, put him in touch with Al-Qaeda leadership, and said, go back to your own country because of your clean skin, your familiarity with target, your ability to be able to swim within the environment undetected, unnoticed. And he was ultimately plotting major homicide/suicide bombings on the New York subway. One of his co-conspirators, the trial actually just opened up today. But this was an example of an American, again, a foreign fighter. At some point, we kind of didn't care so much if they went overseas and killed themselves, but they're coming back. So that does have serious national security implications, and ultimately they have, like many of you, I would assume the World Affairs Council, they have a U.S. passport, so they can travel freely around the country and have less likelihood that they're going to ring alarm bells in terms of some of that activity. So in the past, we were worried about people coming into the United States. Now, we're seeing a hybrid of the threat where it's part foreign, emanated, part domestic, but also you've got Americans traveling overseas, coming back to the United States. All of which begs the big question. And while we have had major successes, and I would argue that the kinetic response This may not be popular, but it works. Drone activity works. Military response works. It may not be something everyone wants to hear. It may actually lead to other people becoming radicalized, but the reason you've seen a drop in the activity in the FATA, in the federally administered tribal areas right now, in terms of focused on U.S. targets, is because we've turned on the heat. Think of it as suppressive fire. The more time they spend looking over their shoulders, the less time they have to train, plot, and execute attacks. That's why you've seen the al-Qaeda threat spread and metastasize, in this case largely to Africa. This may not be a very popular set of issues, but it actually has efficacy. It is working. So put that issue to the side. We have to continue to accelerate that activity. But in itself, we're not going to be able to kill and capture our way to victory. That won't take us to where we ultimately need to be in terms of a more holistic counterterrorism, comprehensive counterterrorism approach and policy. Ultimately, the elephant in the room, in my eyes, is the ideology. Ultimately, that it's the story, it's the narrative. Ultimately, that's what's making, whether it's Americans, or whether it's Pakistanis, or whether it's Afghans, or whether it's Yemenis, or whether it's Algerians, and on and on and on the list goes. They're being drawn to a particular set of causes, and we ultimately need to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's not the economy stupid, but it's the ideology stupid. And we need to start hitting back at the ideology that some are susceptible and vulnerable to its draw. So how do we do that? In my eyes, this is where we need to get a little creative. We need to think a little out of the, to use the old adage, out of the box in terms of some of our thinking here. And I've got my sort of 4Ds strategy that I think can be brought to bear here. The first D is we need to delegitimize the narrative. We ultimately need not just you and I, but you need Islamic scholars, you need others to be able to make the case that joining up with al-Qaeda or the broader set of Islamist or jihadi causes is not the right path to go. You need Islamic scholars to step up. You need to do this in a multi-cultural kind of way. So we've seen some activity in this space, notably in Singapore. You've seen a lot of activity in the Philippines. You've seen some activity in the Netherlands. You've seen some activity to a lesser extent in the United States. You've seen certain activity in the UK. We still need to do more in that environment. So first there's the delegitimize. Then there's the defectors. And if you think about the Cold War, ultimately, what was of much greater value was ultimately to have a KGB spy or a Soviet spy come to the United States. Well, there have been many defectors of al-Qaeda and of al-Qaeda affiliated organizations. In fact, some have written whole books denouncing and renouncing al-Qaeda and their view as a means to be able to achieve their objectives. How many people here, though, have heard about any of these names? Nasir Abbas, for example. Dr. Fadl, for example. This is someone who actually made the religious argument for why suicide bombing and killing of women and children is acceptable for al-Qaeda. Well, you have a number of these folks who now actually stepped out and should be part of the solution set, but we don't hear them. We don't necessarily know. I'd be willing to bet in a world that works in the counterterrorism environment, you'll be lucky if you get a handful of people who can recognize some of these folks. Once you get to the broader community, unfortunately, fewer and fewer are aware. But ultimately, we need to channel that, we need to marshal that, we need to turn that into our set of, into part of our solution set. Because ultimately, they're going to have much more street creds speaking to the young folk who are ultimately seduced by this ideology. Think of, everyone here is familiar with Tookie Williams, probably the biggest gangbanger in the United States, was on death row, still put to death, but ultimately he had much greater effect in dissuading dissuading young men in East LA and California from joining the Crips or the Bloods. I think he was a Blood, don't quote me, I can't remember. But bottom line is we need to be able to build on defectors. Third D, deglobalize. To one extent or another, we've had the unintended net effect of bringing our enemies together. Ultimately, we need to be dividing. We need to be driving wedges, disaggregating, not lumping together. And part of that is very loose use of terminology, very loose use of threat environments. These organizations are different. While they may be conflating because they have common goals and objectives, and they may share tactically operations and the like, ultimately we need to be driving wedges and disaggregating these environments. So think global, act local, work with our indigenous partners throughout the world. Some of whom are part of the problem, I recognize that, but from a counterterrorism environment, we can't always pick and choose who we're working with. So you've got the delegitimize, the defector, deglobalize, and ultimately, to me, deglamorize becomes one of the most important instruments. And here, what do I mean by deglamorize? Well, if you were to look at their own communications and their own propaganda, they lionize and they idolize these suicide bombers. That's part of the appeal. Everyone knows them. Their families are respected. Their children are respected. Ultimately, we've got to pop that image because it ain't what it's cracked up to be. And by deglamorizing, I feel we need to focus much more on the role of victims in terrorism. While we know the martyrs, we know the terrorists, how many people actually know the victims who lost their lives at the hands of Al-Qaeda? And in a weird irony here, a vast majority of Al-Qaeda's victims are Muslim. So why don't we know the names, the faces, the dreams, the stories, especially of the women and children of Al-Qaeda's victims? I would love to see, and this is, forgive the bad pun, but a dead Facebook. Think of a social where we literally remember and have the names and the faces so it makes it real. This is not an academic set of issues. People die, so let's use what they have used to ultimately recruit and radicalize against them. Use some of their own tools and weapons against them. And in the same vein, remember the actual victims. So to me here, there is a huge opportunity that we haven't necessarily seized. And I'm not suggesting we seize it as some Machiavellian. It's the right thing to do. And ultimately, for this to resonate, it's going to have to be the thousand flowers blooming from all over the place. This can't be a centralized U.S. government issue. Ultimately, this has to grow up organically to have credibility and to be able to have the resonance we would all hope it would have. And I might note there was a very positive that I just saw yesterday. In fact, one of the Nobel Prize winning photographer out of Agence France Presse, out of the AFP, his photograph was of a 7-year-old girl who lost 7 of her family members in a suicide homicide bombing at a shrine during a holy time, and literally caught it while instantaneously after the event occurred. To me, that will signal and send, that's what it's really about. It's about humans, it's about people, and it's about the story. And I feel we ought to be doing more to make sure that their story ends a lot quicker than it does. So, I mean, I'm not here to suggest that law enforcement and national security aren't going to be important. They are. The FBI is going to have a significant role, and the good news is they've been on point and they've had success of late. And terrorism is not a numbers business. At the end of the day, a small number of people. How many hijackers were there on 9/11? We're not talking about a big army. We're not talking about a group that had a huge financial footprint, very limited resources, that had huge net effect. So we are going to have to be able to arrest folks, and that is part of the solution. But that is only part of the solution. We also need to start building out some of the diplomatic components, and we need to start building out the counter-ideological components. And ideally, that's going to come from within. It's not going to be externally driven. We can help enable that, we can help push that, but ultimately that's going to come from. So in terms of the CT environment, no time, counterterrorism environment, no time to get complacent. There have been some very successful actions that have been taken, some of which make headline news, many of which will never make headline news, all of which I think are very positive, but we're never going to be 100%. And I, for one, wouldn't want to live in a country that can guarantee 100% safety and security. Build too many walls, the bad guy wins by default because our way of life's been lost. So how do we balance all this within a federalist republic that takes our freedoms and our values very seriously? And then when we start looking at the domestic environment, that obviously adds many new levels of complexity and significance, legal, societal, and ultimately cultural. Which sounds a lot off-base, but it's not. We ultimately need to be able to buy into those solutions. This can't be defeated from Washington. Ultimately, it's all the communities here that are going to ensure that their communities are strong and ultimately can push out the bad blood cells in this case. So that's the counterterrorism environment in a very brief nutshell. I'm happy to get into depth on any of the issues that are of interest. Iran is a country that, no surprise, is taking a lot of Washington's oxygen right now. Not only the government of Iran, but you do have a number of proxies. Hezbollah, for example, is a very sophisticated terrorist organization that does have a presence in the United States. And the question is do they turn that on, and at what point could the government of Iran actually turn to Hezbollah to be able to initiate certain activity? I think a lot of us in Washington were surprised when you saw the Iranian plot on the Saudi ambassador in Washington. We picked that up more through a counter-narcotics investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration. They were coming through Mexico, smuggled into the United States, working with a known narco trafficking organization, and ultimately was going to get these folks in. So we always thought, or many had thought, that the red lines were pretty sure that they wouldn't proactively hit the United States unless they felt truly cornered, unless they felt truly pressured. The good news is maybe they are feeling pressured. I would tend to think that that's being somewhat overly optimistic, although we do have sanctions that are having some effect and impact right now in Iran. So Iran is a country that, when you deal with state-sponsored terrorism, it has some advantages. An actor has an address, there is a return address. When you're dealing with transnational organizations, there may be no return address, so traditional deterrent mechanisms don't work. That said, plausible deniability becomes very difficult to disprove in these sorts of environments. And the biggest issue that's taking up a lot of my time right now are cyber threats. And my overtime, by the way, I've never had one spoken about. Okay, a couple of words on the cyber environment, because I think here we are probably where our counterterrorism community was on 9/10 or 9/12/2001. We have a lot to do to enhance our capacities in the cyber environment. As many of you are probably aware, the ability to to engage in activity without ever setting foot in a country is what is one of the big game changers with respect to cyber. I mean, we've got this environment that we built that has huge upside, that's always on, that has the ability to connect people around the world instantaneously through social media, through financial infrastructures, through technology, through telecommunications. But there's also a dark side to that, and that is one that has huge privacy and has huge security implications that I think we're just starting to get our arms around. Please.
Can you comment on the Patriot hacker that recently came about in the news saying it shut down Al-Qaeda websites for a number of days, and you see that as trending?
Can we hear the question?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. The gentleman had asked about a Patriot hacker who had claimed that he shut down the chat rooms that have ultimately been used by Al-Qaeda and affiliated organizations. And I'll get to that question in 1 second, but one point that is worth recognizing, the ultimate ungoverned space is the internet. I mean, that has the ability to connect the world, like-minded individuals, for good or for bad. The world over can meet like this instantaneously. So if you have an affinity for special interest, you have the ability to galvanize people, which can be used to defeat cancer, it can be used to defeat all sorts of world's ills, but it has also been used by Al-Qaeda and others. And ultimately, if you were to look back at the 58 homegrown plots, almost to the T, everyone had an internet function and an internet role, and ultimately led to them joining up their cause. So the internet is a large ungoverned space, but I'm not sure what the right role of government is entirely in this environment. As to the patriotic hacker, and there have been quite a few. Jester is the most significant individual. You have moms who've been living in Montana, who've been infiltrating, including a judge, by the way, infiltrating jihadi chat rooms. And it's not the websites. Everyone focuses on the websites. That's propaganda. That may be good or bad, I don't care, but ultimately that's like graffiti insiders. It's the chat rooms. It's where the killer application of the internet is not technology, it's people. It's the ability to connect people. And in the counterterrorism environment, they come to an idea and then they interact with other people.